So maybe the plans for your D&D campaign look like this insane diagram of the history of France, and you are wondering, how am I supposed to shoehorn in a backstory that my player plagiarized from Sailor Moon? Sailor Moon in your campaign? It's more likely than you think. Because we're going to be talking about taking your players' very likely anime-inspired backstories and weaving them into your campaign plans so that they find a path in your world that is uniquely theirs. This is something you can't get from a campaign module. You can't get it from any of the Dungeon Master guides, and it's the difference between just being a ranger of the woods, along for the ride, and being a forgotten king whose backstory and future destiny is directly tied to the villain. It's that Baldur's Gate 3 backstory weaving, hyperplot entwinement, everybody has something on the line method of storytelling, aka table running. And I know I can hear you saying, Wes, I'm not a team of over a dozen writers working full-time for years. I don't have years to spend in early access burning Kickstarter cash. But here's the thing. Like a lot of the basics of storytelling, once you learn how to do it, it becomes much, much easier. So we're going to go over some methods. But first, and no, I'm not about to hit you with an ad roll. Don't worry. Lean back in that chair. Lean back. First, the biggest piece of advice I can give to a dungeon master wanting to really integrate their player backstories into their spider's web of emotional involvement is this. You cannot have a storytelling ego when you choose to do this. You have to accept that what you have designed for your campaign is only a rough draft and that you probably are only about 80% done because you're going to be changing it to fit these new narratives in, and we have to accept that change. Just like we have to accept that the slow march of time draws on for us all. And that nostalgia is really only a trap that binds us to chasing a sweetness we'll never taste again. This is why people often feel overwhelmed when trying to tie in backstories, not the existential dread part, well, maybe the existential dread part, but because they feel done, they feel ready, and then they find 10 extra pieces to their completed jigsaw puzzle, and they're thinking, where did these 10 extra pieces come from, Nana? I'm here to tell you, you have to accept those 10 extra pieces. Just like we have to accept that the slow march of time draws on. Stop getting existential. Look, there's a place for those extra jigsaw pieces. So, let's go over some methods. The first and easiest method is what I like to call enemy injection. This is how I picture it in my head, if that helps. If it doesn't, I don't know, close one eye or something. But it works in more than one way. It's basically taking whatever tragic thing your players put into their backstory. Players love putting tragic things into their backstory, and injecting it straight into your campaign, with the intention of making the big bad responsible for it. So, for example, I once had a player who was a sorcerer, and in his backstory, he accidentally turned into a tactical nuke during a bandit attack. So he was young, he had these powers he didn't know about, and while defending his village, boom, accidental death ball, he destroyed his house, his family, and part of his village. And I hadn't planned on having a group of bandits wandering the countryside for this campaign. I hadn't planned on having a group of bandits turning kids into accidental Oppenheimers. But I had planned on having an invading army wandering the countryside, and so I just rewrote that section so that the invading army was partially out and the bandits were partially in. The big bad now hated magic users, and the bandits were hired to purge magicians prior to the invasion. The enemies were injected into the campaign to spread like a little storytelling virus. And this would have worked with tons of other bad guys. They could be working for a necromancer, they could be working for a beholder, or some guy named Twinblade. Right? All this to say we are taking enemies from our players' backstories, in this case bandits, and injecting them into our previous plans. Pretty easy, right? Big bads have henchmen and they have lieutenants, and those henchmen and lieutenants can usually be replaced by people who have already wronged your players, who they wish vengeance on, right? Vengeance is a pretty powerful motivator, actually. We talk about that in the John Wick video. And much like a turkey syringe, it also works in the reverse direction to suck out that savory campaign juice so that you can squirt it all over your player's backstory sandwich. That sounds horrendous. Regardless, in this instance, we are taking enemies that we already had planned, that already exist in our story, that we're ready to use in our campaign, and we are injecting them into the player's past, right? Reverse. With permission, obviously. Like using campaign pan drippings to make a savory backstory gravy. God, I'm hungry. When is November? So maybe you have a campaign set in the Nine Hells and you have some terrible demon planned, and a player who wrote a backstory about their parents going missing or being kidnapped or mysteriously disappearing, which is a bit suspiciously close to other D&D media. But that's okay, right? This would be the perfect opportunity to suck that demon to copy that demon out of your campaign and have it be the reason those parents went missing. To inject that demon into your player's backstory, or if we're following the previous example, make that demon into a savory demonic gravy. We're just making the enemy responsible, right? And now you can have that climactic moment where they defeat the demon and they rescue their parents' souls. And you had already planned this demon NPC. You had probably already planned that encounter. He was existing in your world. But now it's just a little more personal. It makes that path feel unique, even though it was kind of already in existence. This works well with players that are already looking for a bit of mystery. I've noticed that players sometimes will write in this mysterious past kind of language because they want to discover something about what has happened to them. And making an existing enemy responsible for that is super easy and pretty perfect storytelling-wise. In that same campaign I mentioned earlier with the invading force, I had a player who knew he had come from nobility. He had like a signet ring and some papers, some heirlooms and things. But that was all he knew. He just had a name and he had a family crest, and the rest of his family had been lost. He had lost his complete lineage. He knew nothing about himself. He was raised by some other noble family or something. So throughout the campaign, he was searching for his family's lineage. Well, guess who was responsible for slowly siphoning wealth from noble families in order to finance a war? Enemy injection. Think about it. Oh, but Wes, I can't make the water elementals of my PC's backstory part of the legions of my desert-faring big bad. Sailor Moon isn't going to fit into my historical French analog. Right, sometimes you can't use enemy injection because things are too specific or they don't make sense, and that's where the next method comes in, and it's what I like to think of as the parallel plot. Basically, you're going to take an enemy, a situation, a conflict of the player character's backstory, and you're going to have them act as a rival to not only the players, but also the big bad. Right? It's like this scene from, is this Fistful of Dollars? Good, the Bad, and the Ugly? Which one was this? I don't remember. But look at them. They're all going towards the same thing, right? So that as your players are trying to stop the big bad, they're also having conflicts with this rival who, for some reason, just hates them. Maybe because they're only 70% water or something. I don't know. But this works great if you have some sort of item or goal that everyone is vying towards, like a powerful magical object, or $350,000 cash that's buried under a giant W, or a powerful magical object. Maybe your player has written some water elemental parental drowning tragedy into their backstory, and you do plan on having your big bad be a desert-faring worm herder. Well, this is the perfect opportunity to have those water elementals going after something that this desert-faring individual is also going after. What would that be? I don't know, an anti-evaporation staff? This example is getting out of hand. But you get what I'm saying, right? At least I hope you do. Do you get what I'm saying? Let me know in the comments. Commenting is actually one of the best things you can do for a video. But what if you need something more general, less focused on enemies, relying on players' tragic backstories that bring up their real-life parental trauma? Well, my favorite method is coming up, but I want to talk about using MacGuffins real quick. MacGuffin is a term used by disgruntled movie critics to describe typically an object that exists solely to drive the plot forward. So do your players have objects in their backstories? Do they have objects in their inventories? Then they have MacGuffins. I, and probably you, have seen plenty of players include mystical, magical objects in their backstories. Fantasy is filled with mystical, magical objects, and so I often see players be inspired by this fantasy to create their characters. Character creation itself is also filled with these types of objects, and if you're having trouble tying in backstories, you can look to these objects for inspiration. Pretty much every one of the backgrounds, that's not backstories, right? But the backgrounds in D&D has one of these objects. And since players usually choose these backgrounds adjacent to their backstories, you can pretty much count on being able to make use of these objects. The sage gets an old letter from a colleague, the entertainer gets a potentially dangerous favor from an admirer, and there's even a table of trinkets that everyone forgets to roll on that you could just encourage your players to use. right? Pretty much every one of these could just be like a lich phylactery or something. These are things that can act as easy ways to weave in backstories, and you can have that mysterious letter be the hook. You can have that relationship with the colleague be the motivation. The player might have a family ring that is an heirloom that he finds out the big bad poured his power to, or she might have inherited a cursed medallion that the big bad requires to taste apples or something, or maybe it's just the player's grandmother's necklace that turns out to be the heart of a goddess that now needs to be returned. A ring, a medallion, a necklace. Simple things your players might find themselves owners of can become critical plot points in an existent story. You might have planned to have those pirates attacked, but now there is a reason for your player to be involved in that attack, be involved in the main plot in a way that takes their backstory into account and pushes them through the campaign, even if part of their backstory is just them having something like a medallion. This method usually works with backstories that are pretty light or backstories that focus on a single object. And maybe the second lesson here is don't accept things from your family, or do accept things from your family. Look, I don't know, but let's talk about the last method I use. Probably my favorite, definitely the easiest. There are probably some of you out there saying, well, none of these methods are going to work for me because my player backstories are too complex and too difficult to tie into my existing story. But the simplest and easiest method is using that golden goose that is communication and just talking to your players. Say to them, hey, I want to work to tie your backstories into my campaign. Are you into that? Would you be open to having a session, sharing some old notes, sharing some new notes, just about that? And when they say yes, you can tell them about your introduction to your introductory quest, right? No spoilers, just the quest that is going to start the whole campaign. You can tell them what has been happening in your world, right? And what sort of monsters have been plaguing the area, and what sort of rumors that they might be hearing from barkeeps during the first session anyways. Because they have likely lived in this world, right? They probably have some stuff that they know about this world, and so just telling them that and letting them know that you want to really get like who their character is into your campaign works wonders, and it's super easy. In my most recent campaign, I have a group of bandits that are dognapping essentially wolf demigod pups in order to bolster their forces, and when I told one of my players about this, he said, oh, that's perfect. I was planning on having my love interest have been kidnapped, which sounds horrible now that I say that out loud. He was planning on having his love interest. Anyways, but that was part of his backstory. He was out there searching for his love interest. And just letting my player know there was a specific group of bandits active in the starting area was enough for that player to jump on it and write himself into the campaign. I could have just asked for backstories, and I could have just done a little enemy injection, a little parallel plotting or MacGuffining, right? But working with him, giving him some information, and having a little back and forth so that he could find the part of my world that he was most excited about and include that in his backstory was fun for him and just took work off my shoulders, right? And you can take the previous methods to make suggestions on how your players' characters can fit into your main story, right? In short, just ask your players how they want to be involved and they will tell you. And if your players don't want to create backstories, don't want the campaign to be personal to them, that's fine too. Some people just want to experience the campaign raw and unfiltered, and that's a legitimate way to experience a campaign. Or maybe they just don't feel confident in their writing capabilities and they feel a little nervous about writing a backstory. That's fine. But if you find that your players are putting a lot of effort into their backstories, they likely are looking for that more unique path of finding their place in the world, in your world, right? They want that moment where they get to look the man who killed their father in the eyes before they take their vengeance at the end of the movie. Campaign. Also, speaking of the end of things, that's the end of this video, so thank you for watching. I'm Wes, that's Prismo, this is TabletopWriter, where I talk about, and you're not gonna believe this, writing for the tabletop, right? Like and sub if you want, enjoy the blooper, I'll see you next time. To copy that demon out of your campaign and have it be the reason your parents went missing. Their parents? My parents? Are my parents missing?